Good afternoon, everyone. We apologize for the delay, but we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Determining Eligibility of Blood Type B Candidates for Transplant with Blood Type A2 Kidneys. We're so pleased that you could all join us as we have what's sure to be a great presentation in store for you today. My name is Deanna Fenton, Program Manager here at the Alliance, and it is my pleasure to, of course, host today's webinar. Now, before we begin today's presentation, there are just a few housekeeping items that we'd like to review. First and foremost, for optimal visual and audio experience, please access these webinars using the Chrome browser. If at any point you encounter any issues, we recommend logging back in using Chrome. If you're already using Chrome or continue to experience these issues, please try dialing in using the phone number that was provided in your confirmation email. Now, to those of you who are joining us for the very first time on this platform, please take note of the chat feature that's located in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. This chat should be used to pose any of your questions to our presenter. If you have any questions that come up during the course of the webinar, please feel free to submit them at any time. Once the presentation has concluded, we'll have some time for our presenter to address as many of your questions as time allows. Now, for anyone interested in upcoming webinars, please note registration is currently open for our next webinar, Strategies for Success, Navigating Access to Electronic Medical Records. That's coming your way on November 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Registration is also open for our upcoming Brain Death Declaration series, Brain Death Declaration, Better Quality and Uniformity, the Physician's Perspective. Be sure to join us for that on November 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern. For more information on these webinars or to register, please visit our website at organdonationalliance.org. Now, for those of you interested in continuing education credits, we are offering one Step C credit and one nursing contact hour for this webinar. Please note we do also offer a certificate of attendance for anyone seeking fees that are not available. We do recommend submitting this certificate of attendance to your credentialing organization as proof of your participation in this educational offering. Everyone joining us today is entitled to claim either of these credits or certificates. Prior to receiving your certificate, you'll be asked to complete a brief online evaluation that will allow you the opportunity to provide us with your valuable feedback. If you're listening in a group, as many of you are, please be sure to get the evaluation email from your group lead. As a reminder, for nursing, you'll have 14 days to complete your evaluation and claim your credits, and for Step C, you'll have 30 calendar days. Now, at this point in time, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Rebecca Maddox, Operations Manager of Transplant at Mayo Clinic, Florida. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us today, and at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to introduce our presenter.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. Before we begin, I'll give a brief introduction of our speaker. Dr. Nicole M. Ali is an assistant professor of medicine at the New York University School of Medicine, transplant nephrologist, and director of outreach at the NYU Transplant Institute. Following completion of her undergraduate degree at Brown University, she joined the AmeriCorps program Teach for America. She earned her medical degree from SUNY Stony Brook. She is board certified in internal medicine and nephrology and is an ASN certified transplant nephrologist trained at Columbia University Medical Center, New York. She has held positions as the Chief of Transplantation at Hackensack University Medical Center for the Kidney and Pancreas Transplant Programs and the Medical Director of the Kidney Transplant Program at North Shore University Hospital. She has extensive experience working with programs that experienced outcome issues, including system improvement agreements and structuring transplant quality programs. She has published many articles in peer-reviewed journals and presents lectures locally and internationally. Her current areas of research include increasing access to transplantation, improving organ utilization, and novel desensitization strategies. We are thrilled to have Dr. Ali with us today to share the work her team has done for the blood type B candidates, and I will now hand it over to Dr. Ali.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I'm very excited to answer any questions that anyone has. I'll give a little bit of a background as to why this is such an important undertaking for programs to really invest in. And then, our most recent data at NYU is a little bit contradictory to what some of the published data is out there, so I'll end with our unpublished data, but I'll first go through what is really accessible and published. And I will say that many of the slides that were taken from the UNOS guidance documents, which are really great summaries of what's out there and what you really need to know about A2 to B transplants, but I'm happy, I think my email or my contact information should be somewhere. If anyone wants copies of how we do things or our policies, et cetera, you could always reach out to me personally, and I'm happy to share with you whatever I think may be useful or you think may be useful to help your team get off the ground with this. So first, why is this such an important access issue for patients? So as you all know, patients with blood type B are amongst those with the longest waiting time for kidney transplant. And in fact, I'm in New York. These are relatively conservative estimates. These are average waiting times that are published by UNOS, where blood type B patients wait about 6 years. But here in New York, it's actually even more than that. If they're waiting for non-high-risk organs or KDPI less than 85 organs, they can wait upwards of 7 to 8 years for an organ. And given that the unfortunate statistics on dialysis are that 50% of patients, don't survive past the 5-year mark on dialysis, if you've got to wait more than 5 years for an organ, your chances of still being in a acceptable position to accept that organ are unfortunately not great. So I think it's really important that we focus on ways to try to cut down the waiting time and increase access to transplant for patients. And this graph here on the side shows that even more. The bottom line, this orange line here, shows you what the typical transplant rate is for patients with a blood type B. Unfortunately, it hasn't increased much over time. This is taken up until the Kidney Allocation System change in December of 2014, and they're really a very disadvantaged population in terms of waiting time. They're also the distribution of patients who are in this group in this blood group are patients who are really heavily in minority categories, the minority racial groups. So this just shows you a quick table of what the distribution is amongst different populations. And so 19% of the blood type B patients are Black and 25% are Asian. And so this really disadvantages the patients who are heavily in this blood type tend to be minority populations, which have many other reasons why they're disadvantaged, blood type being just one of the reasons. So almost 75% of the patients waiting for a blood type B kidney are minority candidates, as published by UNOS. So why we talk about these A antigens, and I think, to spend a minute on sort of what is an A antigen and what does a blood type B mean. So if you are blood type B, it means that you have antibodies in your blood to these A antigens. So what makes you a blood type B is that you have B antigens. What makes you a blood type A is that you have A antigens on your endothelium, on your red cells, in your tissue. And so for patients with blood type B, they inherently have antibodies anytime after the age of 2 to 4. They develop these antibodies to blood type A, and that's why we can't just put a kidney across blood barriers without doing something to overcome that. One of the Vermeers, one of the hematology pathology groups, showed that the amount of blood group A antigen that is expressed in the vasculature of kidneys is actually relatively low, but it is consistent with that's found in red cells. So when we're checking for antibody to A or antibody to B, we're actually checking what's in someone's serum, what's in their blood, and that tells us, how high is their antibody level. The reason that we're able to do transplant across this blood barrier in people with very low level antibodies is because this group found that the expression of the antibody, the antigen A2 in kidney tissue is actually really low. Within the cortex, within all of the endothelium, within the vasculature, within the tubules, and all of the portions that express antigen is actually low. So when you put a kidney into a blood type B patient and that kidney is coming from an A2 or a non-A1 donor, they actually don't have a lot of antigen that you're exposing that blood type B patient to. Further testing has been done and shown that this is also true in liver transplant, the bile ducts and the liver tissue. And there's also some work being done on pancreas transplant to show this as well. So what we're talking about today, while much of the time and attention has been spent on the A2 to B kidney transplants, it's actually translatable to other organs as well. So this is not a new problem. The blood type B patients not being, having long wait times and not having a huge pool of donors is not suddenly now. They're actually, and UNOS made many attempts to try to even the playing field, or at least, make the gap smaller. So back in 2001, and I don't think I was even a transplant nephrologist back then, or maybe I was just about graduating. The UNOS put out a policy that directed all B organs away from AB patients. AB patients, of course, can accept organs from any blood type, and so they were, at that point, were also getting blood type B organs, which, of course, disadvantaged the blood type B patients even more to have some organs go to blood type AB patients. So at that point, this policy, stopped any distribution of blood type B organs to AB patients unless it was a zero mismatch organ offer. So that allowed us to direct about 10% more kidneys to blood type B patients. And so despite this increase in transplants within the B patients, there was still a gap. So in the 2014 Kidney Allocation System changes, one of the things that was put into place was to be able to enable blood type B patients who have, acceptable levels of antibody to A2 to be able to get transplanted with A2 organs. So what happens is when there's a blood type A donor, a subtype is done on that donor by the OPO, and there have to be two subtypes that both confirm that it's not an A1 donor. And for the purposes of our talk, instead of saying not A1, I'll just keep saying A2. But there are other subtypes other than A1 and A2. All those other minor subtypes get lumped into A2. So you're either an A1 or you're not an A1. And so for the purposes of what I'm talking about, everything that's not A1 I will refer to as A2. So this kidney allocation system change was actually a really big change, but surprisingly, not a lot of centers took advantage of this. The groundwork for the change that took place in 2014 was actually laid by a organ-wide variance that back in 1991, the Midwest Transplant Network had amongst the 6 transplant centers to be able to allocate A2 organs to blood type B candidates. And a lot of the work that we'll talk about today actually came out of the original work over the course of 23 years from the Midwest Transplant Network in terms of figuring out what are reasonable titers, what are acceptable titers, what are the risks, how this whole process would work and impact things. So here's where we've landed. About 2 years ago, only 4% of programs, 4% of patients were actually listed as eligible for A2 organs. And we can see right after the kidney allocation system change here, this dotted line, there was definitely an increase in the transplant of A2 to B organs, and it has steadily increased as more information has come out from UNOS as to how to actually do this. Back in 2016, I think right about here, they released their first really concrete guidance document, and then they released an update to that. But you'll see really despite the resources that are out there, the number of A2 to B transplants isn't really going up hugely. I mean, it kind of went up and now it's back down. It's maybe sort of settled at around, 18 to 20 transplants a month for these patients. Still, though, only about 25% of transplant centers are doing any A2 to B transplants, and that's because I think many of these barriers that have been published and some of the things I've talked to people about. So At Transplant Quality Institute, I gave a very brief presentation about how we've structured our A2 to B programs. And in talking to people who came up to me, realized that there are quite many either perceptions, misperceptions, or misunderstandings and other barriers to why, this is hard to implement at your center. So for many people, it's like, okay, what's the actual threshold? I need a threshold that's safe, but one that's also liberal enough that there will actually be people qualified. If I say the titer to A2 has to be really, really low, like 1 or 2, then very few patients will qualify, but nobody will reject. If I say the titer can be as high as 32, then almost everyone will qualify, but also many people will reject. So where is the balance in terms of what titer is acceptable to your program and what risk are you willing to take on in terms of rejection, and do you have the tools needed to salvage those cases? And we'll talk a little bit about that. Developing an informed consent policy, exactly what do we need to say to patients and how do we tell them what the risk is and what the benefit is. Determining patient eligibility, and by this it's really meant to be the UNet work. When you register the patient, every 90 days someone has to go in and determine, are they still qualified, are they still eligible for A2 offers, and what do you really have to do to determine eligibility, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. This is probably the most financially constraining portion, is all of the resources that are needed. For some people, you may already have a blood bank that's able to run these titers, so no new equipment, no new training is needed. But some places may not have that infrastructure and that staff, then that needs to get in place. The transplant center needs personnel to be able to really manage this expertise of transplant, whether it's from your team that manages your UNet registrations to your clinical team who does the consenting, to your NP physician team who does the management of these patients, both inpatient and outpatient. And there has to be a certain amount of comfort and education and experience that comes with that post-transplant management. The hospital resource is probably can be either the smallest or the largest expense, depending on where you set your threshold, and I'll give you a little bit of insight into what our experience has been with that. And then here, the experience, if your physicians are coming from programs who've done this and trained with it, they may be very, very comfortable. If not, and they're not comfortable with it, then we've got to figure out how do we make people comfortable with these experiences. And I'm happy to be a resource to anyone, team who wants to talk more about the really clinical, heavy, portions of this, including things as specific as exactly what kind of, assay are you using. And happy to introduce you to people who have the real raw resources for that. So first, talking about establishing a titer. There are different types of titers. There's an IgG titer, and then there's a combination IgG-IgM titer. So the IgG titer is just, one portion. Your IgM plus your IgG will be a higher number. And there's been different things published in the literature. There's been, 1 or 2 case reports of really bad rejections, which make people worry about what is the downstream if I don't do A or B. I think that that's going to come down to your clinical team partnering with your lab or your lab pathologist to determine, what the capabilities of your lab are and what is the comfort level that you have. For us at NYU, we just do IgG titers. The Vanderbilt experience that is very nicely published relatively recently, earlier this year, they do both IgG and IgM titers, IgG and combination IgG-IgM titers. And they have a nicely published paper on what they do with those titers. But at the end of the day, their cost is also significant because they are treating for their combination titer. In terms of the resources, your lab needs to first figure out which methodology is going to work for them. There are different methodologies. There are ways of doing like sequential tubes to check your titer. It requires a bunch of dilutions and measurements, and personnel that are really adept at doing it, because it is something that from one person to the next can be subjective, and I'll give you a glimpse into that when we look at the Vanderbilt experience. And then your staffing. If you're doing these, and these are all deceased donor organs that UNOS is allocating in this segment, you have to have the ability to get rapid turnaround for your titers. And that was one of the things that for us at NYU, we had to ensure that we could get timely turnaround, because we do recheck the titer when the patient comes into the hospital. And we need to know before we go to the operating room, is their titer still acceptable compared to what it was previously? So we needed 24-hour, 7-day-a-week service, rapid turnaround. That meant our lab had to have enough personnel trained to do this particular test, which is not that common of a test. Only the transplant program, and really only our kidney transplant program, is utilizing this test. So we really had to secure the buy-in of the lab and their staffing. In addition, when there was turnover in personnel, there became variability in the results, because this is, if you picture it, there are sequential tubes that are in front of you, and you have to read at what point is this dilution appropriate. So there's up to, in some labs, a 1 titer variation. So the titer could be 1 to 8 as a read, but that may be 1 to 16 or 1 to 4. Or there may be 2 levels of variability. Typically with tube testing, there can be 2. The gel testing is a little bit more accurate, and it's usually only about 1 titer off in terms of variability, but it is something that not a lot of labs are doing. So it's something that, you and your lab director really have to talk about. And then establishing a protocol for that titer. So every center needs to have a protocol or policy in place for what titers are acceptable, what level of titer are you using to enroll patients as eligible in UNET, and at what frequency are you going to monitor that. So for Vanderbilt, they used titers of 1 to 8 for IgG and less than 1 to 64 for the combination. At NYU, we use titers of 1 to 16 for the IgG, and we do not use the combination. It is really up to your center to determine what titer you're comfortable with. Certainly, the higher the titer, the more risk you run of rejection and needing to salvage the organ if that does happen. So, for a new center starting this, it may be reasonable to start at a lower titer and then establish the experience and make sure your workflow with your lab is good and make sure your turnaround time for results is good, and then branch out from there. You can always revisit your protocol or revisit your policy after you've done this for 6 months or a year or have a certain number under your belt. So it is something to consider, engaging your clinical and your lab team in that decision. So now, once you have your protocol, of course, what draw me to transplant is there's never a boring day, and that holds true. So we have a protocol, we have everything beautifully mapped out, we have a lab that's great, and then, of course, once in a while, something will happen, and you're not expecting it. So we actually had a case. It was actually not a deceased donor case. It was a living donor case, which was a very straightforward A2 to O desensitization transplant, and everything that could be imagined to not go well happened. And so the patient had what was almost a hyperacute rejection of their organ, even though the A2 titers were very, very low going into transplant. There was not any significant rebound after transplant on post-op day 0. But on post-op day 1, there was a very significant rebound, and that was completely unexpected. And in retrospect to the day before, there was rejection probably already happening. So in that case, we really had to be equipped and be very rapid about salvaging this organ, about, doing an early biopsy. Most places, don't jump to do a biopsy at post-op day 1. And so biopsying early, knowing what's going on, and being aggressive. You have to have a discussion of the what ifs. While they're unusual and rare, we all have to have contingency plans of the what ifs. So if a rejection were to happen, are we do we have access to plasmapheresis 24/7? Do we have access to Rituxan? Do we use Rituxan? Is that something that we would want to use? Because remember, Rituxan is going to help for your future B cells, but not really for the ones that are causing the AMR right now. Splenectomy. What's our threshold for splenectomy? Because ultimately, a splenectomy is what will, be able to get rid of the most B cells that drive antibody-mediated rejection. So is your patient strong enough to be able to withstand desensitization, plex, splenectomy, if that, God forbid, happens? And are your surgeons comfortable with that? Or do you have a team that can do a chemical splenectomy as opposed to a surgical splenectomy? And then ultimately, eculizumab is a great drug at stopping the complement deposition and cascade of terribleness that is ensuing, but it is very costly, and it is not reimbursed in the DRG for the hospital. So, if you're running a very tight margin, as we all are financially with kidney transplant, $25,000 for a dose of eculizumab that you then have to replace after you do the next plasmapheresis, is that something that your transplant administrator can manage? Is your program able to incur that kind of cost? But also, is your hospital able to get that sort of drug? That's a great conversation to have with your transplant pharmacist. Not that it will happen frequently. It certainly is a very rare event, but it is key to know what are your backup plans. What is available in your arsenal if this were to happen? If you transplant that patient with a titer of 1 to 16, and on the next day that titer is now 1 to 24, and your kidney's not making urine, and there's definitely rejection there, are you able to do some combination of these things? What's the comfort level of your team? What's the financial and physical capabilities of the team? Will they sign off on you getting eculizumab? Can you get 24/7 plasmapheresis? Is your team willing to go down the road of splenectomy? Those are the type of things that have to be considered in your contingency plan. Not that these have to be written in your policy, but it should really be a discussion with your clinical team before, you kind of really go down this road. They should just kind of have it in the back of their head. So now, as we said before, at this point now, the A2 to B utilization is increasing, but it's still really quite low. Less than 8% of patients are registered as eligible for an A2 kidney. A smaller percentage than that are registered as ineligible. The vast majority of people are still on UNET as unknown. And what that says is they haven't had titers checked. They haven't been, they were listed a while ago and nobody went back and looked at them, or the center isn't participating in A2 to B transplants. And I think this is where we have the potential to have the biggest impact in terms of transplanting patients. So in terms of the logistics, and I'll try to move faster because I know we've got much more to cover. The informed consent, I'm happy to share our piece of the informed consent for this. First of all, it does have to be written. So when we first underwent our PI project that I'll show you at the end, we thought about doing, verbal consent over the phone, but in looking at the UNOS policies, it does actually have to be a written informed consent. So it's important that patients sign that they understand what they've been consented to. And this came out of the UNOS guidance document, some of the things to cover, why it's advantageous to receive organ offers that are non-A1 organ offers, and I'll show you some of the data that you can certainly use towards that statement. At least it's relevant at NYU, and I suspect it should be relevant just about anywhere else. What are some of the risks? We've talked about that, the risk of rejection. That is a not frequent but real risk. What are the specific requirements for maintaining eligibility at your center? And that's where you have to determine, how often do you want patients to get blood work done for these titers? And then the standard statement that I'm sure everybody's consent has, that this has been understood and all questions have been answered, et cetera. So here's how we integrated this into our workflow. We actually put it in our evaluation consent. When we found that we had multiple pieces of paper for patients to sign, there would always be something that didn't get signed that they'd have to come back and sign, or et cetera. So we integrated A2 to B into our full evaluation consent as one section, and patients actually have to check off whether, yes, they agree to this, no, they don't agree to it, or they'd like to defer any decision. Now, at that time, you're probably saying to yourself, how do you know everybody's blood type? We don't. So our statement says, if I am a blood type B patient and I am found to be eligible, then checkbox A, B, or C. And this way, we are able to capture it. We open up that discussion at the evaluation about this option for blood type B patients. There are a handful of patients who do know their blood type. Most patients don't. And we tell them, well, if your blood type turns out to be B, we may have you come back and draw up an additional test, and this is what we would be doing with that test result. We go through the whole consenting, so it does take a little bit longer if we're doing it with all the patients, because there are people that we're explaining the concept of A2 to B2 who it's not relevant to. But we incorporate that into our incompatible discussion as a whole, so that they understand, there's incompatibility, but levels of compatibility. There's incompatibility, and then there's desensitization options. There's incompatibility, and then there's swap options. So this way they kind of have all of it kind of packaged in one. And we address the risks, benefits, et cetera, at the consent time and again at the organ offer. So when the patient comes in, when the patient is called with the organ offer, they're informed it's an A2 to B transplant. We review the risks and benefits again then. And when they're actually brought into the hospital for the transplant and we draw that repeat titer on them, they're again consented at that point with the surgical team. Patient eligibility is more of a workflow issue in terms of needing to confirm in UNET every 90 days whether that patient is still eligible. So for us, it's our data team that deals with the UNET confirmations, and we've given them guidelines on how to confirm and who not to confirm. At NYU, we do not check the repeat titers until the transplant or if there is a sensitizing event, because the titers we don't think really fluctuate that much. Now, of course, there may be a case where somebody does fluctuate, and that's why we capture it on the pre-op. And so that's why our lab needs to have a very rapid turnaround, because we are not checking, a month before, 2 months before the organ offer. We're checking at the hour or two before the surgeon goes to the operating room. Things to consider: how often you'll require these titers. Are you comfortable, checking them every 3 months, every 6 months? Not until the transplant. And then who will actually perform the confirmation, the click of the button in UNET? And are you going to require that titers be reviewed before confirming eligibility, in case someone falls out of that? This all really comes down to, the work burden and the cost of implementing systems like this versus the benefit of increasing access to transplant. And I hope my NYU slides will really convince you that there is a significant benefit to this. So the financial investment, I took this out of the UNOS guidance document. It's actually a really nice summary of all of the things that we had to consider and all of the things that are recurring costs. It is something that your financial team will have to think about. However, the majority of these costs are pre-transplant costs. And so although they're not directly necessarily reimbursed by insurance, they are available to be put on your cost report. And so it's not as costly as you end up thinking it is. So now onto the published experience from Vanderbilt. So this was published just in April of this year. It reviewed their 3-year experience from 2014 to 2017. The main points was that, I'll go into a lot of detail about it, but the main two things that they really pointed out that were different that I didn't have for NYU is that they found that their costs were higher for A2 to B transplants, and that in their projections, they really found no significant difference between creatinine, patient and graft survival, or eGFR. So we know that it works. We know it may be costly. But I think the cost also depends on how you do your protocol. So in that time period, they did 29 A2 to B transplants and 50 B to B transplants. So they compared pre and post anti-A titers, graft survival, renal function, and hospital costs. Their lab methodology, I think, was very detailed, which is why I included it here, and I thought it was a great snapshot of what's available out there. So one option is to do both combined IgG and IgM titers, and that is done in your untreated serum. For us, we actually do a treated serum, so this DTT-treated serum gets rid of your IgM and gives you only your IgG level. What was really nice about their publication is they were able to give you both. So they had their IgG alone and they had the combination, and they determined what they did based on that. There are 2 incubations, 30 minutes here and 30 minutes here. So best case scenario, you get turnaround time in just over an hour if your lab is really focused on getting this done. So you have to take into consideration, are they going to have the staffing to process the sample as soon as you get it to them, and how quickly can that be validated and turned back around to you so that you know whether to proceed to the OR or not. It is time and personnel intensive, and there is, some inter-variable, inter-user variability. At Vanderbilt, they were extremely lucky. They've got, at the publication from the Midwest, they were actually extremely lucky in their titers. They had the same 3 people doing all of their titers and had been there for 20 years. We are not so equipped. We do have a team of about 5 people that are trained to do this, but they haven't been doing it for 20 years. And sometimes if that person is not on at night, we do let our blood bank know, hey, there is a potential A2 to B transplant happening tonight. Please make sure someone is staffed to be able to give us turnaround results. So there's also got to be really good communication between you and your blood bank or whoever is running your titers. For some people, it may even be their HLA lab that does it instead of their blood bank. So for Vanderbilt, they wanted 2 consecutive titers that the IgG levels were less than 1 to 8, and the combination titer was less than 64. Anyone who exceeded either of these thresholds was determined to not be eligible for a A2 offer. They did note that they had patients whose combination IgG-IgM titers were higher than 8 but less than 64. And so much of the data out there that's published actually cites a level of 1 to 8 as pretty sensible and reliable to not have a high risk of rejection. As I said, the lower the titer, the more likely you are to not have a rejection. So in this in-between, they actually did choose to do some interventions, plasmapheresis, IVIG, and Rituxan to lower this titer. There is not data out there to support whether this titer must be lowered, whether this combination titer is very strongly associated to rejection. There are some reports that IgM is associated with rejection, especially in two A2 to O cases have been reported. But this is where that cost difference came up. Plasmapheresis, IVIG, and Rituxan is a substantial cost, and almost 60% of their patients actually fell into this category, which is also why they couldn't just stick to low titers. They would have had not many patients in their eligibility cohort if they were too conservative with their cutoff. They did see an increase in titers from pre-transplant to the time patients were discharged to when they, 2 weeks after transplant, but they did actually settle back down, and this is without any intervention between week 2 and 3 months, They did settle back down. They did not report how many of these patients had rejection, however. So I can't tell you that. What I can tell you is the long-term graft survival, they were able to publish 2 to 3 years of experience on their patients, was very comparable in both graft survival and patient survival, and they also did projections out to the future, where it shows very little difference between the two cohorts. Ultimately, this did result in almost a $25,000 difference between the two types of transplants for the hospitalization cost, and almost double the cost in terms of their organ acquisition cost. So that's really what the Vanderbilt experience showed. They also did not show any difference in waiting time, and that's maybe the one biggest difference between our experience in New York at NYU. So I'll show you that quickly. So what we did is we had, when we started doing this, we had a lot of patients who were on the waiting list who had not been checked for A2 titers or had A1 titers checked accidentally by the previous protocol. And so we went back, we took a group of us together. So I was the physician lead, there was a nurse coordinator lead, an assistant coordinator, and our data team all engaged and said, look, we have this protocol that we've now written. We have our established thresholds. We want to actually screen these patients, get them consented if they would be qualified, and get them updated in UNET. And there is really no data out there about the impact that this would have on their waiting time, so we wanted to take a look at that. So first we got a list of all of our blood type B patients. We contacted them and had them come to the NYU lab to have their A2 titers drawn. At that visit, they also came by our office and were consented that, if their titer were to be low, it would fall into our eligible criteria, then they would be, then if they agreed, they would be updated in UNET. And for us, we used a titer of less than or equal to 16. So in this project, we had 83 patients at the time who were blood type B. That was about a third of our waiting list at the time. It's much different now, but at that time, it was a pretty sizable portion of our waiting list. 57 of them ultimately had A2 titers checked at our lab. 55 of them actually were found to be eligible based on our cutoff of 16. We had 4 patients who titers exceeded our cutoff, and so they were not listed as eligible. The patients who we didn't screen either were inactive or didn't respond to our request to come to the lab. And we found a really substantial difference in terms of waiting time. So looking at this, about 2.5-year cohort, little under 3-year cohort, when we compared the waiting time from the date that we listed the patients to their transplant, for blood type A patients, you can see it's about 30% less than the patients with B. That's from the day that we listed them. But when we took into consideration their dialysis time credit, it was actually half. We were able to transplant our blood type A2 eligible patients in half the time compared to those waiting for a blood type B kidney. Here in New York, there's a huge difference between 3.5 years versus 7 years. And so you can see here, it was really, really impactful for our patients to be able to get transplanted faster. None of the patients who we transplanted had rejection. None of them experienced AMR, and so we felt our titer of 1 to 16 was reasonable. So of the people who we did screen, 93% of them were found to be eligible for an A2 organ offer, and we did find a substantial increase in their transplant rate. So given that over 70% of the patients are blood type B on the waiting list, expanding to those groups access to A2 organs really does, I think, really will have a huge impact in terms of improving transplants, decreasing waiting time, and getting patients better long-term outcomes off dialysis. This is my whole team of people who worked on this project, so a great thank you to them. And I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Ali. We're now going to open up the floor for questions, but before I turn it back to Rebecca to facilitate the Q&A session, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you do have any questions for Dr. Ali, please be sure to submit them using the chat feature. Just as a reminder, you'll find the chat feature located at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Also, during the Q&A session, I'll have this poll up. So for those of you that are listening in a group, if you could please just complete the poll and let us know how many people are participating in your group, we greatly appreciate that. Thank you. So that being said, I'll go ahead and turn it back to Rebecca to moderate your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We do have, it's going to take a little bit to get some to roll in, but we've got a few here already. So first one for you, Dr. Ali, can you speak to the rationale for your center's choice of A2 titer threshold and how you handle the patients with titers on the higher end of your cutoff?
Very good question. So we have the benefit of having Dr. Robert Montgomery as our director of the Transplant Institute. So we've got a great wealth of knowledge in incompatible transplants, as well as a huge expertise in terms of salvaging rejection. I don't think there's a kidney he hasn't that he's gotten scared of yet. So we were really comfortable because we had the expertise. We have him to bounce cases off of, to really, we so benefit from his knowledge and his experience. So we set a high titer. So that titer of 16 is, I think, on the higher side. For those patients, we absolutely get a second titer before they go to the operating room. We were getting titers on everyone before they get to the operating room, so it's sort of the difference between Vanderbilt, which is published, and us. Vanderbilt checks the titers periodically prior to the transplant at a certain interval. I want to say off the top of my head it was every 90 days or so. For us, we check the titer when the patient comes for evaluation or whatever day they're going to check it. We update them in UNET based on that titer as eligible or not eligible, and then we do not repeat it. The next time that we repeat it is at their pre-op visit. Now, if in the interim we found out they have blood transfusions, then we will repeat that because these titers can change a little bit, but they don't usually make huge jumps. So if my patient's titer is 1 to 2 or 1 to 4, even if they made a huge jump, they'd still be under 1 to 16. But if they're already at 1 to 16, they don't have a lot of wiggle room in terms of going to 1 to 32 or 1 to 64. 1 to 64 would certainly be a problem. 1 to 32 might be a problem. And so for those patients who are teetering on that 1 to 16, we will repeat their titers most definitely before we go to the OR. And we always have a backup patient just in case that titer comes back high, because, of course, your opportunities to do plasmapheresis before deceased donor transplant are not great at 3 o'clock in the morning. Hopefully that answered the whole question.
Yeah, it actually answered someone else's question who asked how frequently you check them prior to transplant, so that you answered 2 questions there. Another question was, do you think a titer of 1 to 8 is too conservative?
I don't think so. I think especially if you're starting off, so when the Midwest started off in the 1990s, they actually had a titer cutoff of 1 to 4 for that variant for quite some time, and then inched it up. I think that if this is where you're starting and you haven't done, incompatible and A2 to B transplants before, and you want to test the system, it's absolutely reasonable to use a titer of 1 to 8. And the majority of our patients had titers of 1 to 8 or less. It's actually just a handful of patients who had 1 to 16 because they were either really, really high, like 1 to 64, 1 to 128, or they were really quite low, 1 to 2, 1 to 4. So I think 1 to 8 is a great, reasonable place to start. It gives you time you'll definitely have some patients that will qualify. It will give you time to try out your process, to make sure your lab turnaround time is good, to make sure that if you had needed pheresis, it would have been available, et cetera. And then once you have some under your belt, you can always increase from there. But I think 1 to 8 is probably what most people are using, and it's quite reasonable.
Okay, thank you. Is there a requirement that ineligibility be reported to UNOS?
Not that I know of. Only that patients who are eligible be reported. But UNOS's thought was that for all the unknowns, it was just that people would actually click yes or no, and if it's unknown, then it's that they didn't check the titer.
Okay. And then we've got a question, is there any correlation between high CPRA and elevated anti-A titer?
That's a great question. There actually is not. I should have added that to my talk, sorry. So that sensitized patients sensitized to HLA do not necessarily have high anti-A titers. There's actually good data to support that there's no correlation between them.
Excellent. I think I've got one last one here. Hopefully we have time for it. How much time was invested in the PI project that you presented today?
That's a great question. Very little. Actually, for all that came of it, it was work that my waitlist coordinator and assistant would have been doing anyway because they would have had to update other labs. So we met over the course of 4 weeks for about half an hour once a week just to keep tabs of what was going on with the patients. And my coordinator was new at the time, so wanted to really review every titer to make sure she wasn't making decisions that she wasn't comfortable with. And so, we met, we reviewed, we brainstormed about, this patient's not calling back. Maybe we should call his dialysis center and see if he's still around. And so it took about 2 hours of meetings, and then the phone calls were split between the coordinator and the assistant. The order entry for us takes about 5 seconds. It's an order set that's built into Epic that is really seamless, and the results interface right back in. And we actually used two offices. We used our NYU office, and we have a satellite office about an hour away, and we were able to create an interface there as well, which took about a day or two for them to do. So it was really not very time intensive, but it was very much, I think, worth it in terms of getting people qualified and transplanted.
Excellent. Well, I think that wraps up all the questions that we've had submitted so far.
It actually looks like we just one last question.
Yep.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Okay. What causes the titers to fluctuate?
So most of what causes the titers to fluctuate are humans reading the titers. So the way this works is you take the person's serum. You're actually going to take an aliquot of that serum and you split it into a bunch of test tubes. So you've got test tubes that are diluted 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 4, 1 to 8, 1 to 16, so on. And most places will go maybe up to 128. So you've got about 10 test tubes in front of you. A person has to actually manually dilute these down, measure them, put in the binder, put in the A1 cells, do a whole thing. And so it's a very manual process the way this is done with these tubes or gel. So, and then they read it based on the reactivity of the tube. So what one person may think is reactive mildly at this dilution, another person may say, oh no, that's not reactive at all, that's negative, that's like the control. So most of the fluctuation is really user end, which is why you want to have a small team that's doing it consistently if possible, rather than 20 people in the lab who can do it and each of them does it, once every 2 months. You won't have very good interrelatable consistency if you have a wide team that does it infrequently. And I see the last question. So should a 1 to 28 titer be retested if it was 1 to 8 prior? Yes. That person may have had a blood transfusion just before they got the 1 to 128. We actually did have 2 patients like this in our study, and we didn't include them, but Dr. Montgomery's input was that sometimes you may get a huge fluctuation, maybe when somebody had a transfusion or had an FSP, and that's one thing I actually neglected to mention. So very important, when you're doing plasmapheresis for these A2 to B or any incompatible transplant, if you use plasma, so FFP replacement, as part of your plasmapheresis protocol, you must use FFP that is compatible with the donor, not the recipient. The donor FFP is what determines how much antibody you're going to be infusing into that patient. And this was a struggle for our lab and actually some of our team members to understand in the beginning. Say you have an A2 to B transplant, and you need to give FFP for pheresis or because they're bleeding or whatever reason. You actually have to give blood type A FFP to that blood type B recipient. And in the beginning, the struggle was that, oh my gosh, but you're making me give incompatible blood product to this person. And in fact, there is no red cell in FFP, so it's not a red cell incompatibility. FFP plasma has no cells. It's just plasma, and in that plasma is all of the antibody. So if you were to give blood type B plasma to the B recipient who received an A kidney, you would be infusing a ton of A antibody into that person. So maybe the person with the 1 to 128 titer had received plasma, and therefore that became the reason why the titer went up. So it would be worth repeating, definitely.
All right, it looks like there are no more questions in the queue. So with that being said, I'd just like to once again thank Dr. Ali for joining us today to share her expertise on this topic. And additionally, of course, I'd like to extend a sincere thanks to Rebecca for taking the time to join us today and facilitate today's discussion. So thank you both so much. And to all of our participants, we thank you for taking your time to join us as well, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day and week. Thank you.